Our topic tonight is the Babylonian Captivity, and we're talking about the original Babylonian captivity, so the exiles from the kingdom of Judah that had been destroyed, taken into exile in the actual city of Babylon, as opposed to the Babylonian captivity of, the metaphorical Babylonian captivity of the papacy, when the popes of Rome are in exile in Avignon, France, and are under control of the French court in many ways. So this is the literal Babylonian captivity as opposed to later metaphorical echoes of that. When we think of like these major moments in the development of Judeo-Christianity, we divide them into the First Temple period, the Second Temple period, and then after the destruction of the Second Temple, the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which is the main line of Judaism that exists today. We identified the Samaritans as one of the groups that emerged after the destruction of the First Temple as a separate group, essentially when Second Temple Judaism begins. Then, of course, sects within Second Temple Judaism, like the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees, and ultimately the Jesus movement, and how that movement in turn becomes Christianity. Anyway, one of those key moments in transformation is that destruction of the First Temple and the period in between the First Temple and the Second Temple, which is the Babylonian captivity. This is the beginning of Judaism being experienced in diaspora. So as opposed to Judaism that is centered around Jerusalem, living in the land, now the leadership is in exile in Babylon, and then there's other group of exiles that are existing in Egypt. And this transforms how the religion had been lived and changes it in very important marked ways, although it in no sense is achieved at this stage anything like what we now think of as modern Rabbinic Judaism or Christianity for that matter. It is a very, very different identity still, but some of the key building blocks are put in place as we'll see. So the 137th Psalm is written by a Judahite poet, perhaps living in exile in the city of Babylon after the destruction of the First Temple, after the destruction of Jerusalem. So one of the poetic names for Jerusalem is Zion, which is the name of one of its hills, and so poetically that name then gets referred to the whole city. So this poet wrote one of the more famous psalms that evokes this whole topic that we're exploring tonight, the Babylonian captivity. And so he says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy." So, this is a psalm of mourning, but it's obviously also a song of deep memory. This is oaths here that let my right hand wither if I forget this component of my identity, this focus that we have on Zion, on Jerusalem. And ultimately for the exiles, this kind of mourning memory is about identity formation. We are continuing to be exiles as opposed to people who have now moved to Babylon and are assimilating into Babylonian culture and becoming Babylonians like all of our neighbors who are around. And one of the things we can pick out of this also, and this is going to be true in antiquity, anytime you have someone who has the capacity to write, this is part of the elite class, since only very wealthy people are able to write, and it's generally a courtly or at least certainly part of associated with the royal courts, and then some of the top merchants and artisans might also are using writing for their figures and so on. But poetry like this is a courtly component, and the exiles here, therefore, are elite exiles, and they are being asked by other members of the court of Babylon to perform, to sing. And so it's showing that this is being written by a courtier, a court style of function. So we don't normally quote the next part of it, but there is, a final stanza that goes on, and it takes on a dark and vengeful turn. And so after, it says we don't want to forget Jerusalem, now it says, "Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." So wanting vengeance upon ultimately the Babylonians who destroyed Jerusalem and took them into exile, but then also remembering as an outgroup and as negative neighbors, the Edomites had been very close neighbors of the kingdom of Judah, just immediately to the south. They're remembered here as allied with the Babylonians in destroying the Judaic kingdom, and so now this identity formation is also about saying who we are and who they are, and the them, the outgroup, includes the Edomites, the Moabites, and so on. Ironically, so when whereas this may be true that the Edomites had been rivals and may have been pleased to take advantage of Judah's downfall, a similar thing had happened a century earlier when the northern kingdom, when Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. The kingdom of Judah didn't help out and instead took advantage by allying with the Assyrians, and indeed had its great rise after the northern kingdom, which had been so much more important and more prosperous, actually fell. So anyway, we don't always recognize that kind of, our own kind of hypocrisies when it comes to those kind of things. Okay. When we are looking at the Levant, what is sort of the larger area of, what is now Israel and Palestine and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, but at the time we called this maybe the Levant or Greater Syria, the western part of the Fertile Crescent. The Levant, in general, is a relatively small territory between much larger neighbors, much more powerful neighbors. So it's especially stuck in between Mesopotamia, now think of as Iraq, and Egypt, which tended to be the cradles of civilization that had great imperial powers. But there's also nearby Anatolia, Asia Minor, what we now think of as Turkey, which could be the seat of a large empire like the Hittites, and also beyond Mesopotamia is the great Persian or Iranian plateau, and so where Iran and Persia can also be the heart or the seat of very large empire indeed. And so it's really when those normal or more traditional centers of empire, like Mesopotamia, when they are in disarray, that kingdoms based in the Levant, like Judah or Aram or Phoenicia, are actually able to really thrive. But it's very difficult for them to have the basis of and being the center of an empire. So, for example, we mentioned the destruction of the northern kingdom. This is when the great Mesopotamian Empire of Assyria was at its height in the 7th century BCE. And Judah, as we say, was a client of the Assyrian Empire that had its major rise as the Assyrian Empire declined. So let's look at the kind of background of the great powers so that we can consider where Judah is in all of this and how the exile happened in the Babylonian captivity. So Assyria was based in northern Mesopotamia, and it conquered from there the whole Fertile Crescent, including Babylon, which is at the center of the southern portion of Iraq, the southern Mesopotamia. And the Assyrians also conquered the Levant, including the destruction of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, in 720 BCE. And the Assyrians even temporarily conquered Egypt, which they held directly for a decade, and then they replaced the previous Egyptian dynasty of pharaohs with a new dynasty that was their allies. Before, in the 7th century, the late 7th century, Assyria broke into civil wars and had a very rapid decline. That's on the one side. On the other side, we have Egypt, which had been a great power going way, way, way back. And so as early as the 3000s BCE, had been a unified kingdom ruled by pharaohs. And frequently, when it was strong, it would have imperial ambitions, and the kind of easiest place to immediately start conquering is, again, the Mediterranean coast, so the Levant, Canaan, and Syria. So after briefly being conquered by the Assyrians, as we mentioned, the 26th dynasty of the pharaohs, which was the last native dynasty in Egypt prior to the Persian conquest, this dynasty regained Egypt's independence initially as an ally of the Assyrian leadership. So with the collapse of the Assyrian Empire and the fall of its capital, Nineveh, Pharaoh Necho II led an army into the Levant to assert Egyptian control over the region. So there's chaos, and so the Egyptians are maybe taking opportunistic advantage of that. As they're doing this, Egypt begins to be in conflict with the Babylonians. The Babylonians are the great power that revolted against the Assyrians and overthrew the Assyrians and start to put together a new Fertile Crescent-based empire. So Pharaoh Necho, as part of his campaign in 609 BCE, goes to the great city of Megiddo, which had been a provincial capital in the Assyrian Empire in the Levant. And there he is met by King Josiah of Judah, and Necho then kills him there. The Babylonians we were mentioning, after centuries of subjugation to the Assyrian Empire, Babylon emerged from the Assyrian civil wars in the 7th century as the great capital of this successor empire. So Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar II reigned for 43 years. And a lot of times one of the things that's happening is when you are on the rise, if you could have that kind of stability in a monarchy, that also helps build up your power. Nebuchadnezzar successfully contested with the Egyptians over the Fertile Crescent and ultimately brought the Levant, including Judah, into the Babylonian Empire, as opposed to allowing the Egyptians to take that control of that area and add it to their sphere of influence. And so the ultimate picture here, by the time we get to the Babylonian captivity, is a Middle East with the Fertile Crescent in the middle, dominated by the Babylonian Empire, which includes some of the heartlands of the Assyrians. Then a Median Empire, which is their allies in destroying the Assyrians, ultimately owning that Iranian plateau, including Persia. And so this is the predecessor state of what will ultimately be a Persian Empire. Egypt has been kind of contained, but can still be powerful in its own little corner. And then there's a state in Anatolia, Lydia, that has been emerging. You can see all of this is going to come together at the end of the Babylonian captivity, when the Persian Empire combines all of these different states. So let's look at the kind of timeline so that we can kind of see where the Babylonian captivity fits here. So this is a zoom in of the normal chronology that we normally look at. And so we're looking here from 800 before the Common Era to 500. And the Babylonian captivity is the period of time that we have after the bar here in purple, that is the kingdom of Judah, disappears with the fall of Jerusalem in 587, and before the fall of the Babylonian Empire in 537 with the return of the exiles. So just in terms of background context, we have before that Assyria's conquest of Israel, its kind of brief conquest of Egypt, as we can see. This is when there is a rise of Judah as exiles from the northern kingdom come and join the court, and there is an upswing of literary writing that occurs in the court of King Josiah and his successors. And ultimately also, because Judah has been able to be part of an Assyrian economic system, it also allows Judah to grow and its country to become more populated and Jerusalem to grow. Nevertheless, the decline happens pretty fast, and so King Josiah, who has been this last great hope for the kingdom of Judah, is killed, like I say, by the Pharaoh Necho, and then Judah is being fought over by the Egyptians and the Babylonians. The Babylonians ultimately win and destroy the kingdom entirely and annex it, and then are in charge until they are in turn defeated by the Persians, who ultimately also conquer Egypt. So that gives us our kind of a background context. So, like I say, when we're in the First Temple period, Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah are fairly small and are therefore at kind of the mercy of these greater powers around them. And that, on the one hand, is true militarily, but it's also true in terms of power, culture, influence. And so Assyria in that time period is affecting Israelite and Judahite the courts, how they behave, their military, even their religious traditions. And all, at the same time, they also look in the other direction to Egypt, which is continues to be a power that has influence in the area as well, and especially for Israel and Judah, which are immediately next to the Egyptians, as opposed to, let's say, if you're Phoenicians that are way up the coast, you're farther away from the Egyptians. So as we are getting to the end of that First Temple period, Jerusalem has expanded a lot from where it would have been when David would have been around. So we don't we've talked a lot about how David is essentially the eponymous ancestor of the house of David, and what's really known about him as a historical figure is simply that the kings of Judah understood themselves to have had a founder, David, about whom we have a lot of literary tradition that probably doesn't have a lot of historicity to it. But nevertheless, the original little sliver in there of what Jerusalem had been is what the city of David was, and then the temple complex, which is assigned to David's kind of legendary son, Solomon. Then by the time we're getting to the last generations after the fall of the northern kingdom under Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah, the city has expanded significantly, and there is a new western wall enclosing a new portion of the city. And this is sort of the kind of prosperous time that is the beginning of literary tradition that is getting the whole biblical setting rolling. So the kingdom of Judah's height naturally corresponded with the decline of Assyria, because as we say, when the great powers are there dominating you, you aren't able to have a strong power in the Levant. Instead, now, though, as they are declining, small clients like Judah are able to assert more of their autonomy and independence. So Josiah assumes the throne at the age of 8, and so that means that he had regents and counselors. There was a faction that was ruling in his name, but he ultimately becomes old enough to have the majority and become king in his own right. So he reigns during this prosperous end of the first temple period. So let's look about what it says in the book of Kings, 2 Kings, about this time period, the very end before the Babylonian captivity. So Josiah was 8 years old, we hear, when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David. So David is not his father, but this ancestor David. He's of the house of David, so he's called a son of David here. Josiah did not turn aside to the right or to the left. He's doing exactly what a king is supposed to be doing according to the biblical author here. So the Deuteronomic historians, as we call them, the editors of the books from Joshua through Kings, judge the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah by their fidelity to monolatry, which is to say, worshiping the God of Israel and the God of Israel alone, and putting down worship of any other gods. And so, as a result of this, the Deuteronomist rates Josiah's great-grandfather, Hezekiah, who is said to have destroyed all of the high places, so all of the ancient shrines where Yahweh and other gods are worshipped outside of Jerusalem, and begins the centralization of Yahwehism in Jerusalem. So he is a very, very good king, according to the biblical writers, but they absolutely condemn Josiah's grandfather, King Manasseh, who restores the pagan cults to the Jerusalem temple, as a wicked king for doing that. So Josiah here is given special praise, and he's even compared with David, anticipating the program that he is going to have. So we read in the 18th year of his reign that Josiah, now around 26 years old, orders that the temple be repaired. And as they are doing that, it leads to a discovery. So we read that the high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan, the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." So this is an amazing discovery. Inside, when you went in the temple to look around, they found the book of the law. When Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, "The priest Hilkiah has given me a book." Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. And when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes in abject grief. So Josiah has this reaction because this book of the law that was found in the temple contains commandments that he has never previously heard and that nobody in his kingdom is obeying. So these are presented as ancient commandments in a book newly found that people are not obeying, and so now we need to start obeying them if we are going to accept this as a legitimate book. The book becomes the basis for a religious reform according to the Bible. So the king, Josiah, directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him went all the people of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. The king commanded the high priest Hilkiah, the priests of the second order, and the guardians of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord all of the vessels that had been made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all of the hosts of heaven, all the other gods besides Yahweh. And he burned them outside of Jerusalem in the field of Kidron, and carried their ashes to the shrine at Bethel. So Josiah's reforms then eliminate all of the shrines to the other gods, so the gods other than Yahweh, in the Jerusalem temple, and then all shrines to Yahweh as well outside of Jerusalem. So centralizes worship on Jerusalem and eliminates all worship other than Yahweh worship. The book also included the introduction of the Passover festival. So there are now new religious practices. So the king, we read, commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God as prescribed in this book of the covenant. And the Bible goes on here to say, no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, even during all the days of the kings of Israel and of all the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. So Josiah's grandfather, King Manasseh, who had supported all of the different gods and all of the pagan shrines, all of the Canaanite shrines in Jerusalem and in the Jerusalem temple. And we also are told that he practiced the Canaanite religious practice of infant sacrifice. So the firstborn of every womb is to be sacrificed. So one of the religious reforms that may be being described here now that this new Passover is being experienced for the first time, the idea of the Passover is the angel of death passes over, or the angel probably essentially originally the god of death, no longer demands the firstborn, and the household shows that because you have had a substitute sacrifice, you sacrificed a lamb or another animal and put the blood over the lintel, that means that the sacrifice has been done. A substitute sacrifice has been appeased, and so the religious reform here is trying to eliminate this practice that had been very common in Canaanite religion. So it's happening pretty late here in Josiah's reign here as we're getting to the end of the First Temple period. So unlike the stories in Genesis and Exodus, which are set centuries and even millennia before those books were composed, the first draft of the Book of Kings may actually date from the reign of Josiah or in the immediate aftermath, the next couple decades. So as a result, the narrative details of finding this book and the religious reforms are more likely to have historicity, although there are arguments that some scholars make that that these actually occur, are actually written later, and that these still are probably not historical, but some anyway. there is a potential to argue it both ways, that this is maybe the very beginnings of some of the biblical historicity that is actually traceable, because this may be when the texts are being written. As early as 1805, so biblical scholarship has been going on a long time, scholars have suggested that the book that is found by Hilkiah is Deuteronomy, or maybe the earliest component of Deuteronomy. So the Deuteronomic law code, which is now chapters 12 through 26 of the book of Deuteronomy, which is generally understood to be the oldest part of the book, where other sections of Deuteronomy then are added by later authors and editors during the exile in order to connect it into the rest of the biblical history that is being written. And also there are anachronisms that are introduced into those sections that are effectively giving theological answers to why the temple and the kingdom will be, or in other words, have been destroyed. So those parts are later, or the whole book is later, but sometimes many scholars think that the portion of it here is coming from this time, time of Josiah. In 1943, as this idea was taking shape, Martin Noth, who is a German biblical scholar, coined this term that we use, the Deuteronomic histories, to identify the texts from Joshua to Judges as part of a composition that maybe preserves some older texts or edits together a bunch of older texts, but nevertheless brings them together in order to share a particular theological outlook. And specifically, that is the Deuteronomic cycle, which is that you are blessed when you are worshiping Yahweh. In other words, when you are worshiping Yahweh only, when you go to monolatry. But when you forget Yahweh and go to paganism, you will be punished by Yahweh. In 1968, Frank Moore Cross proposed maybe that a first draft of these texts was compiled during the reign of King Josiah. If so, then that means we have later editors who have added to it, because editorial revisions and sections were added after the exile, including, for example, the last few chapters of 2 Kings, which tell of the kingdom to its destruction after Josiah's death. So this is the earliest likely or possible date for any of these texts, or for a draft of this, but and the argument can also be made that this is happening in the exile or even later. The Deuteronomist believes, as I say, that God punishes those who forget him by turning, and when you turn to other gods, and bless those who remember him by putting aside all of the other gods. And because Josiah does that so very strongly, it should augur a long, blessed reign for Josiah. Instead, we read in 2 Kings, in the days of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, but when Pharaoh Necho met him at Megiddo, he killed him. His servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. So, like I said, according to the Deuteronomist theology, Josiah should have been blessed with peace and a long life. And so in order to explain such a righteous king's death, the editor is forced to kind of make a reaching argument, so an apologetic argument. So the editor or author here says, before Josiah, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law, all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So this is a great king. They had a lot of hopes for him. Still, however, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, against the kingdom of Judah, because of all the provocations which Manasseh had provoked him. So his grandfather, Josiah's grandfather Manasseh, had been such a terrible king that God is still busy punishing Judah for it. The Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel. And I will reject the city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house which I have said, my name shall be there. The house of which I have said, my name shall be there. So, unable to explain, how King Manasseh, who had reintroduced all the shrines to all the gods in the Jerusalem temple, and it brought back the temple prostitutes and everything else, even the practice of infant sacrifice, how could that king have had such a long, peaceful, successful reign, while good King Josiah was struck down so ignobly by Pharaoh? The second edition of the Deuteronomist redactor essentially assigns the blame for both Josiah's death and the fall of the kingdom back to Manasseh. And so this is another potential argument, this argument of embarrassment of why maybe this is when a draft of this is being written. Because if you were just creating sort of mythic stories like they're able to do with the book of Judges, then the story always ends properly according to the Deuteronomist's theology, which is to say, the people are always punished when they forget the Lord, and the Lord raises up a judge. The judge is able to miraculously defeat all of the enemies, and the people remember Yahweh, and they live in peace for a generation until they forget the Lord, become wealthy, and the whole thing happens again. So the cycle works perfectly when it's able to be entirely literary, when the stories are entirely mythic, or just based on a legendary hero. But now, as it's getting to the time period when maybe the text is actually being written, or it's being at least the time period that is being remembered by the authors, they have to come up with apologetic excuses for why their theology didn't work out. Later, during the Second Temple period, a scribe who had access to the Deuteronomic histories, the books from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, had that as his source and wanted to rewrite them. We call this the chronicler. And the chronicler often did this by fixing stories that are embarrassing, or even eliminating altogether embarrassing stories, changing them so that embarrassing things don't happen. Again, probably with the idea of replacing those texts. They probably didn't circulate enough that the chronicler maybe thought, well, I'll make a new version of this, a shorter version, and then these older versions will maybe fall by the wayside. Instead, what ended up happening was we have those same 6 books in the Bible, and then Chronicles comes right after it. But Chronicles sort of fixes this Josiah story. 2 Kings simply stated Josiah went to meet Necho at Megiddo and was killed there by him. Chronicles reimagines this meeting as a battle. So we read in the book of Chronicles, after all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, King Necho of Egypt went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But Necho sent envoys to him, saying, What have I to do with you, King of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, and God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God who is with me, so that he will not destroy you. It's very crazy unusual words of God coming in the mouth here of Pharaoh. But Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but joined battle in the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Take me away, for I'm badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him to his second chariot and brought him to Jerusalem. There he died and was buried in the tombs of his ancestors. So, the idea here that, the words of God are issued by the mouth of Pharaoh is a very strange apologetic idea. We can maybe say again, as the chronicler is trying to figure out how we can explain why Josiah, who had been the super righteous king, why is he killed in this ignoble way? So at least it's upgraded to a battle. So this meeting at Megiddo. So Megiddo was a major center. It had previously been a royal city, part of the kingdom of Israel. So later, these are, as it's subdivided into Assyrian provinces, where Judah is a client kingdom, and Megiddo, Gilead, and Samaria are the former, they're the provinces that are ruled directly by the Assyrians that formerly made up the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. So Megiddo is right there on the coastal route that you would be taking as you go up from Egypt and are going to Syria to, initially he would have been allied, Necho would have been allied with the Assyrians, but by the time he meets with Josiah, the Assyrians have been overthrown. So Necho here, his dynasty had been allies, like I say, of the Assyrians. He might have originally wanted to bring them aid, but with the Assyrian Empire's rapid collapse, he and the Egyptian army may have been opportunistically asserting their own control of the newly liberated Levantine powers. So maybe the reason why Josiah goes to meet him is that Pharaoh, who brings a huge army, summons all of the local kings of the different client states and also the upstart provincial leaders who are now kind of independent, and says, I am now asserting Egyptian control over all of this territory, and Josiah perhaps looked at him the wrong way, or whatever it is. We can't know. We don't know exactly what happened, but in any event, it's not what the Deuteronomist would have expected. It's not what the biblical writers would have wanted to have happen if they're creating this story from scratch. So Josiah's inglorious end, like I say, was inexplicable for the theology of the Deuteronomist, and it was embarrassing for the chronicler. So whether or not there was any battle, the death of Josiah was kind of the beginning of the end now for the kingdom of Judah. The location at Megiddo, which is sometimes also now called Har Megiddo, which means Mount Megiddo in Hebrew, but the Har is actually a tell. It's a ancient city that's been built up on ruins, has been built up and left a big hill, which is like a tell. The location of Har Megiddo and the death of Josiah inspired the later Christian writer, John the Revelator, his vision for a battle at the end of the world taking place at Armageddon, this Megiddo place where Josiah died. So it's seen as a very important turning point, and it actually really was in terms of the history of First Temple Judaism. So after the Pharaoh kills Josiah, Judah initially falls within Egypt's sphere of influence. Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, initially becomes the new king, but the narrative in Kings tells us that Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestors had done. So unlike Josiah, all the rest of these kings are not good kings. Pharaoh Necho confined him at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and imposed tribute on the land of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and he changed his name to Jehoiakim, Anyway, there's all of these guys have harder and harder to say names at the end, and they all sound the same. But anyway, the Pharaoh took Jehoahaz away. He came to Egypt and he died there. Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land in order to meet Pharaoh's demand for money. He exacted the silver and the gold from the people of the land, from all according to their assessment, to give it to Pharaoh Necho. So Judah now becomes a heavily taxed client state of Egypt. It's completely under the control of the Pharaoh, who is able to actually depose, exile the king, and put one of his brothers on the throne, and as I say, exacting a very heavy tribute for Egypt. Meanwhile, under Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians continue to try to assert control over all of Assyria's former empire. And so Jehoiakim, this guy who the Pharaoh put on the throne, switches his allegiance actually from Egypt to Babylon and becomes a Nebuchadnezzar's servant, as they say, for 3 years before deciding that he has to rebel and reassert his independence. And so this is the kind of path that the kingdom is on for the last little while. It's trying to go it alone where it can. There are factions within the kingdom that are pro-Egypt and others that are pro-Babylon, wanting to have a Babylonian alliance or an Egyptian alliance or go it alone. And ultimately, they're not able to go it alone by themselves. So Jehoiakim died and was succeeded by his 18-year-old son, Jehoiachin, just as the Babylonians were besieging Jerusalem. So he dies probably during the war in the fighting. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to the city while his servants were besieging it. So he comes to Jerusalem himself. The king of Babylon, King Jehoiachin of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself, his mother, his servants, his officers, his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. He carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and all of the treasures of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord that Solomon of Israel had made. All this as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials, all the warriors, 10,000 captives, all the artisans and all the smiths. No one remained except the poorest people of the land. He carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officials, the elite of the land. He took into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. The king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000, the artisans and the smiths, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. The king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. So now Judah becomes a client state of Babylon. The Babylonians bring the former king, members of the royal family, the entire court, members of the army, all of the artisans, and leave behind Zedekiah as a client king. All right, so let's look at the end here of the house of David as rulers. So Josiah, we had all these name changes, so I thought we'd maybe say what the names even mean. So Josiah is that last king that the Deuteronomists hoped would be this great king who has all of these reforms, but is killed by the Pharaoh, Necho. So Josiah means Yahweh has healed. When he dies, Jehoahaz, whose name means Yahweh has held, reigns, but he's immediately deposed by the Pharaoh. Pharaoh puts Eliakim on the throne, but changes his name to Jehoiakim. So that just is changing from there's both theophoric names, but you're changing from an El name to the Yahweh version of the name. So it means established by God and then established by Yahweh. So Pharaoh is probably not caring about that kind of a name, but it's just maybe asserting control. And it's also showing there's so many of these Yahweh names. It's showing how important Yahwism is for these last kings. So Jehoiakim is probably killed by the Babylonians. His son, Jehoiachin, is deposed by Nebuchadnezzar and brought away into exile in Babylon. And then his uncle, Mattaniah, his name is changed to Zedekiah, so from God's gift to God is my righteousness. He is put on the throne before he's ultimately deposed, as we'll see. So Zedekiah himself, after reigning as a client of the Babylonians, rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, who responds by once again bringing his army to lay siege to Jerusalem. So King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. They built siege works against it all around. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So it's a multi-year siege. The 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, they're sieging it for the last two or 3 years. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine inside the city became so severe that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city wall. The king with all his soldiers fled by night by way of the gate between the two walls by the king's garden, though the Chaldeans, so the Babylonians, were all around the city. The king and his army went in the direction of Arabah, but the army of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, pursued the king and overtook him on the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered, deserting him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, who passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and then they put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him in fetters, and took him to Babylon as a prisoner. So Babylon obviously completely crushes the rebellion, and it's not just bringing him into a nice exile. They've actually killed his sons before his eyes and blinded this last king. When that happened, then having now put down one more rebellion than he ever wanted to deal with, Nebuchadnezzar decides to burn the house of the Lord. So he burns the temple, he burns the royal palace, he burns all of the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. All of the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. So they burned everything, then they also tore down the walls. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had defected to the king of Babylon, all of the rest of the multitude. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest people of the land to be vine dressers and tillers of the soil. So anybody who's even remotely elite now, they're taking and they bring them into exile in Babylon. So Judah is now fully incorporated into the Babylonian Empire. It is no longer going to be a client state. It is now a province with a governor. A governor, Gedaliah, is appointed, who is not from the Davidic royal family. Nevertheless, while he is reigning or governing, a member of the royal family, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, who's still at large, forms a conspiracy and he assassinates the governor, which then causes everybody to panic. And we read that all of the people, high and low, and the captains of the forces set out and went to Egypt, for they were all afraid of the Chaldeans. They're all afraid of the Babylonians. So anybody who had remained in the land as part of the elite, including the remaining army forces of the province, the Judahite army, fled now to Egypt. And so finally the book of Kings ends with the earlier exiled king, the first group of exiles, Jehoiachin of Judah, is ultimately released from prison in Babylon and given a place of honor at the Babylonian court, which starts to describe how the exiles end up becoming courtiers instead of prisoners. So that doesn't happen for Zedekiah, who was seen as a traitor, but for Jehoiakim. So kind of just brings us back. I just thought I'd bring back this chronology slide so we can kind of see it again. You can see those last Josiah and the last kings Josiah, who's killed by Pharaoh, the others who are killed or deposed or imprisoned by Nebuchadnezzar as the Babylonian Empire ultimately destroys the kingdom of Judah. Meanwhile, in addition to the kings, we have active prophets. And so both the prophet Jeremiah and Ezekiel are alive in the time period before the fall of Jerusalem. And they both now go into exile, although they end up in the different directions. This begins this moment when Judaism, so now First Temple Judaism is gone, and now we have the beginnings of Judaism as a diaspora religion. So the Yahwist religious reforms were still relatively new in the kingdom of Judah. There had been reforms, as we see biblically, under Hezekiah and Josiah, with the idea of centralizing the religion and making sure that Yahweh is the only God that is worshipped. But again, in the immediate lead up, so Josiah's grandfather Manasseh reverses all of that, and so the full Canaanite pagan worship at Jerusalem was happening also very close to the end. So this is still relatively novel, this centralization and Yahweh focus. And it's something that is happening among the elite. So the vast majority of the common people continued to remain in the land as peasants. The biblical text minimizes it, but the proportion of people in a population pyramid in antiquity or even in the Middle Ages, the elite is just the very tip of the pyramid, and everybody in terms of the bulk are all agricultural workers, and they would have all remained, and they just would have had new overseers effectively that the Babylonians will have brought and appointed to collect taxes and so forth. So those peasants continued to practice Canaanite folk pagan practices, and that continued on. And there's actually a lot of the lived religion actually has its change even later. So after the exiles return, and specifically it reaches down to the common people, especially in the time period of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, in response in part to the challenge of Hellenism. But even so, the Bible pretty much ignores the common people, and civilization isn't usually focused, or history is not focused on the common people as much as it should be, but instead is focusing on the people who can write and read and the elite. And the bulk now of Judah's elite, therefore, are finding themselves in exile, and they are now part of a diaspora. That means they are not living in the land anymore, they're living in these exile communities. And so the exile period then begins as exiles flee to Egypt and captives are taken to Babylon. So there are these two different communities as the land becomes a Babylonian province that is where the elite is not there anymore. So let's look at the people in Egypt. So after Gedaliah, the governor's assassination, like I say, the leader of the remaining Judahite army, Yohanan, who was potentially Gedaliah's successor as governor, but at a certain point realized that he needed to get out of there before the Babylonians came and destroyed everything again. So he fled with his forces to Egypt. The prophet Jeremiah went with him in exile into Egypt, even though he was prophetically warning against the plan. He didn't think that they should be going to Egypt for their exile, but that's where they went. It seems like what happens is that Pharaoh establishes these soldiers, this military force, at a outpost in Upper Egypt, at the site of the first cataract, around, which is where Aswan is, where the Aswan Dam is, the island of Elephantine. And so they create a community for them there. It's very normal, actually, for these like world empires when you have, let's say, what's going to become for you a mercenary or an ethnic army force that is now going to work directly for you and your empire. It makes more sense for you to put them on the other side of your empire than on the side where they're from. So you wouldn't want to have this Judahite force on the border with Judah, because at some point or other they might try to conquer that part of Egypt that is next to Judah and reconnect with their countrymen that might be back in Judah. Instead, if you put them on the other frontier, the frontier now with Cush at the deep south of Egypt, then they are going to be more loyal to you because they don't have any allies anywhere near there. And so this is a normal kind of tactic of world empires. When they're at Elephantine, the Jewish community is able to make a temple of its own. And so there are sacrifices that are performed there for Yahweh, but also for other gods. And so this indicates that for this exile community anyway, the monolatry focus, Yahweh only, wasn't as central, since they obviously are maintaining traditions of having additional gods that are part of their religious worship. And then also the strict kind of biblical prohibition of having, of the centralization of having sacrifices take place anywhere other than the Jerusalem temple. Here's a temple where they're able to have, a separate temple. So they have a different religious focus in the Egyptian exile community than is occurring in Babylon. Jewish soldiers continued to serve in Elephantine even after the Persian conquest of Egypt, and maybe even especially then, because the Jewish people got along very well with the Persians, and so the community might have even been reinforced. Nevertheless, local Egyptians didn't like a foreign ethnic group among them, and also were occasionally trying to revolt against Persian overlords, and so Egyptian priests around the year 410 apparently bribed Persian officials to let them destroy the Jewish temple in Elephantine. The Jews from Elephantine then appealed to countrymen all around to help them rebuild it, get funds to rebuild their temple, which apparently it was. It didn't necessarily, we don't know what happens to it over time. So how long it lasts, it falls out of the historical record. However, even though we don't have as good a records, Egypt continued to house a diaspora Jewish population. And when the Persian Empire fell to Alexander and Alexander's successors, the Ptolemies, the Jewish population vastly increased, as we see, and became centered in the new Ptolemaic capital of Alexandria, which ended up having a very large exile Jewish population indeed. Okay, let's switch also then to Babylon. Whereas the exiles in Egypt were stationed at a frontier as part of the military, the exiles in Babylon, including members of the Davidic royal family, were at the imperial capital, Babylon itself, where they had opportunities to serve as courtiers, as state officials, as scribes. And so this allowed the Jerusalem courts significant literary output. All of that activity that had been occurring in that last fertile years of the Judahite monarchy under Josiah and his successors, that was able to continue in exile, which is one of the reasons why the Babylonian exile is so much more influential than the early Egyptian exile, which doesn't have texts. One example is that the prophet Ezekiel did all of his writing in Babylon, or in Babylonia. He had been part of the first group of those deportees. So before Jerusalem was destroyed 10 years later after Zedekiah, but that whole first group that went with the first king of Judah to Babylon in 597, and then he wrote all of his prophetic writings after. So like the author of the priestly voice within the Torah, so the author that is always talking about all the rules for sacrifice and all the way that that priests are supposed to behave, all the boring parts of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. That priestly voice, Ezekiel is part of that same kind of high priestly community, the Zadokite lineage, a clan that claims descent from the semi-legendary high priest of David, Zadok. So their eponymous ancestor is Zadok. That group's ideas become especially important for shaping the identity of the exiles. So the Davidic line continues. So Jehoiachin, who was deposed by Nebuchadnezzar and is the first king that's brought to Babylon, he becomes the leader of the exile community. It's a name that tradition many, many centuries later gives the title Exilarch. And so by the time we get to the 2nd century of the Common Era and then all through the Middle Ages, there continues to be an exile community based in Persia, in Babylon and Persia, and the leader of that community has the title Exilarch, or Rosh Gola, the head of the exile in Hebrew. Exilarch is the kind of Latin, Greco-Latin name for that. Jehoiakim has his sons with him, and one of those, Shealtiel, has a child named Zerubbabel, and probably also Sheshbazzar is another son of Jehoiakim. So those two, as we've seen, Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, are the leaders who take the exiles back to Jerusalem when the Persians conquer Babylon, and they create a Persian province of Yehud centered around Jerusalem. And so both of those are the leaders of the exiles who return. The fact that Jehoiakim's grandson, Zerubbabel, has an Akkadian name, which means seed of Babylon, indicates kind of the speed of the exiles' adoption of Babylonian culture. Of course, to be able to be part of the court, they're going to have to be able to speak the local language and understand the courtly rules and so on. They are also being influenced by all of the Babylonian imagery and ideas and everything that is all around them. However, unlike the earlier Israelite elite that had been resettled in Assyria, so the so-called lost 10 tribes, that group fully assimilated. The reason why it seems that the Judahite elite maintained their distinct identity was, at least in part, because they had these written works. So either they had written these first drafts, they certainly had memory that they had found this book, this important book, in the reign of Josiah. They brought them with them to Babylon, their sources, and they reworked them, or they were busily composing new works while they are in exile in Babylon, works that become identity formational. And so when the Persian conquest of Babylon happens in 539, this exile community was given permission to return to Jerusalem to build the temple, but actually, just as importantly, or probably more importantly, Babylon continued to serve as a capital of now an even greater empire, the Persian Empire, and the still extremely large and important Jewish diaspora community there continued to provide courtiers now for the Persian court and the Persian kings. And so there continues to be influence there, and also the influence that the Persians and Mesopotamian culture continue to exert. So as we go into the Persian period, exiles return to build the second temple, and some of the diaspora Jews might have returned too from Egypt, but the diaspora continues in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, as the Jewish people now in the Second Temple period are part of this larger Persian world empire. And so that brings us back full circle to these charts. And so this is this moment when now a religion, the First Temple Judaism, that had been extremely different, has a transformation because, one, it is experienced by the elite in diaspora, so they're no longer in the land, they're in exile, and two, because the focus has come on text and identity formational text and stories. There's another whole transformation that happens through the Second Temple period, and the destruction of the Second Temple leads to still more transformations that occur in Rabbinic Judaism and modern Christianity as well. And so I think we're going to end there, and we'll let Leandro tell me what kind of questions you guys have been having and thoughts. So first off, I want to thank JM and Matthew Rakowski and Dave Anderson for all of your support. Julie Bazuski asks, did the Babylonian captivity begin the transformation of Judaism into a text-based religion without the need for a temple, despite the fact that they immediately built a second temple upon return? So they are able to operate, like you're saying, they're able to operate during that time period without a temple. And so even though it remains a core focus, which is why they immediately go back and do that, they are able to live it for several generations, like you say, without having the temple, or at least having one in Babylon. The Egyptian community does feel like they have a need for it, and they have their own one in Elephantine. So I think so, yes. That's one of the focuses. So one of the two major focuses, along with also just simply being in diaspora. Matthew Rakowski says, how much did Babylonian law influence both Jewish and Islamic law? So I think that there's been a lot of studies on Mesopotamian law in general, and so so when we're talking about this Babylonian Empire, and actually even this Assyrian Empire that I was talking about today, those are often called the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is because there are later iterations of earlier Mesopotamian world empires that are centered in Assyria and Babylon. And you have to go back to the beginning of the first Babylonian empire to have the early great lawgivers, and those lawgivers are important precursors for all of the later Mesopotamian, all the later Near Eastern law, including Jewish law, and then Islamic law is very much influenced by Christianity and Judaism, so it's very much influenced. Also it has a lot of its own local traditions that were already existent in pagan Arabia before the time of Muhammad, but the scriptural components are very much influenced by the Bible. Jared, thank you so much for your support. Michael Luce says, in what script should this found book have been written? So it would have been written in Paleo-Hebrew, but it's which is almost exactly the same as what we think of as Phoenician. So Canaanite, Paleo-Hebrew, Phoenician, this is all essentially the same abjad. So it is that's not a complete alphabet because they don't do the vowels for those, but it's essentially the same thing as the Phoenician. And so then this is like one of your points, one of the points of how much influence happens so fast. So when they come back, when the exiles come back and they're part of this world empire, they have stopped using their own script. The modern Hebrew isn't based on Paleo-Hebrew, it's based on the Aramaic alphabet, or abjad again. So again, they stop using the original Hebrew writing system and adopt the writing system that had been used by the world empire. Andrew Becker says, can you expand on how the Israelites, the Samaritans, thought the Judahites, the Jews who came back from exile, had been corrupted by Zoroastrianism and no longer practiced the same faith? Well, we are going to have a full lecture on the Samaritans, and so yeah, there are the two sides have a lot of times when you were going into schism, when you are against your neighbors, people who had been really close to you, you especially dislike them, and so you end up with all kinds of apologetic arguments back and forth. And so the Judahites have their apologetics that they say about the Samaritans, and the Samaritans, the Israelites from the northern kingdom have the same looking back. And so we'll look at how that grew in a lot of detail the next lecture. Kelly Higgins says, any indication the found book, Deuteronomy, is an apologetic for reforms taken for unpopular reasons? Well, there is definitely the reforms that happen. So we can look at what Deuteronomy says, but we can also look at the reforms that that 2 Kings say happens. So the reforms that happen include destroying, all of these shrines, preventing people from worshiping in traditional high places in the countryside, and centralizing everything so that for all the sacrifice that you're able to do locally within the kingdom has to be brought to the capital. It has to be brought to the Jerusalem temple. So it puts, for example, the local Levites out of business. The Levites are given then instead just a supporting role for what the high priests are having, the temple priesthood is able to have. And so a lot of that is unpopular. So if you are an Israelite woman who has an especially close personal relationship with Asherah, and now you're no longer able to worship Asherah, or at least you can't do so very easily at any kind of at the traditional shrine that you would have gone to, that could have been a very unpopular reform. There are many of those practices might have been very popular with a bunch of people, and now there's a change that happens. So some people are interested in the change, and some people like change, but sometimes there are going to be other people that don't like the change. And so I would say, yeah, some of these are unpopular, and the book gives legitimacy to making change. You often in religion want to have everything have antiquity, and yet reformers are actually imposing new things. And so the advantage of having a book that is supposedly an ancient book is that it gives antiquity to the new changes that you want to make. Winston Barquez says, was the Torah written in its almost final form during the Babylonian exile? So we don't know exactly when it is written, when all the different pieces are written. So the idea is that it doesn't exist before the exile in its present form, but that it's maybe maybe as early as Ezra, so the time period soon after the returnees go back and rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem, that it's taken its final form then in the Second Temple period, in the early Persian period. And so maybe that's when the earliest date for it being in this form that we have it comes. Let Something Shine says, since ancient Canaanite Hebrew and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics did not use vowels in their writing system, could Pharaoh Necho be Enoch, since it's N and CH? I don't think so. No. so I don't think that that's where they're getting. I don't think that that's where they're getting Enoch. And I think that one of the things we can say about Enoch is that I think that Enoch might actually be Henoch. So I think that there actually might be there might be another letter there, or that gets knocked off in English. So I've never heard that before. I don't think so, and so I'll say no. So Ricky Palacios says, how much of the Babylonian capacity? I'm sorry. How did the Babylonian captivity influence the book of Daniel? So the book of Daniel is set during the time frame of the Babylonian captivity. So Daniel is a legendary figure who supposedly lived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, but the book of Daniel is written many, many centuries later, and the author of the book of Daniel doesn't really know too much about the actual history of the Babylonian captivity, and they're talking about events that they're concerned about in their own time frame, which is the time frame when the Seleucid kings of Syria are asserting their control over Jerusalem and are desecrating the temple with Greek statuary and so on. And so I would say that the Hellenistic age is what's influencing the book of Daniel, although the book of Daniel is set during the time period of the Babylonian captivity. Christopher Musante says, are there any influences in Ezekiel and Daniel from what they learned in Egypt? So in terms of so Ezekiel didn't go to Egypt. So Ezekiel, it's Jeremiah who ends up in Egypt. And he is talking about it at the end, in the end of his book. I'm not sure how much he learns, because that's really just the very end. In terms of Ezekiel's spending his whole career in exile in Babylon. And so he's thinking about that and learning about it from that direction. As I mentioned, the book of Daniel is a much later book, and so it's understanding a context of the Hellenistic time period, and so it's not as focused on Egypt, but it is focused on this later time period. Kelly Higgins says, in Babylonia, were Jewish scholars commingled with scholars of other communities in exile, other conquered peoples' elites? So the biblical text says yes, and so when it says that the exilarch, the exiled king, Jehoiakim, when he's released from his prison and puts off his prison clothes and wears clothes of a court official again, or a courtier, then he is able to have dinner with the king of Babylon and also all of the other exiled kings. And so the various exiled elites are coming together to presumably be part of a broader court in this great empire and its great capital. So they're commingling. They're all then learning like a common language together, a lingua franca, and some of them may be just directly and fully assimilating. Others, like the Judahites, are maintaining their own identity by maintaining their own identity formational narrative literature. K. Tempest Bradford asks, why did the Egyptian Pharaoh care about theophoric names of the Judean kings? Does it have anything to do with why Yahwehism became prominent? So yeah, I think it's a little strange that the way that the biblical author says that the Egyptian Pharaoh changes, puts somebody on the throne and changes his name, and that same thing happens when the Babylonian king puts somebody on his throne and changes his name. I think what the biblical author here is illustrating is they're saying that this is a real client king, because the ability to name somebody is the control over that person. So I don't think that Pharaoh is coming up with that name. so rather this prince has more than one name or more than one version of the name, and so it's I think that the point in the story of the Pharaoh or the king of Babylon changing the name of the king is simply a literary device that's showing that those guys are in charge, that these kings of Jerusalem are not really their own kings anymore, that now a greater power is in charge of them. And I think that you're right about the theophoric name. So the idea of changing your name from an El name to a Yahweh name is probably showing that these last kings have special devotion to the Yahwism cult, or centralizing Yahwism worship. Michael Lewis says, was the part of Deuteronomy found by Josiah transliterated to the Aramaic script? Is there any clear proof of this? I don't think we have any. I don't think we have any biblical texts in Paleo-Hebrew. Maybe I would have to. I don't think I'm wrong about that. There might be. I think there might be like the name of the scribe Baruch or something like that, written on some kind of a seal that we maybe have in Paleo-Hebrew, but I don't think we have any of the texts in Paleo-Hebrew. So all of our texts, the earliest actual manuscript texts that we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so those are all written in the Aramaic script. I don't know that it would. I don't know that there would be any clear evidence about it, because I think it's a similar thing. It's just a matter of switching the one characters for the other characters. Jeremy Brown says, do we have any idea when and where the book of Job may have been written? It seems to be answering the question of the problem of evil in response to the failure of the Deuteronomic answer, but it does not seem to have a Zoroastrian influence with its lack of the cosmic devil. Yeah, so Jeremy, we have, I've done a whole lecture on Job, and the interesting thing about Job is that it doesn't have any one author. It is actually a book that has been expanded by multiple authors, and so as a result it has a bunch of different, actually it has a bunch of different competing answers to the problem of evil, but perhaps the earliest part of it and the most challenging part of it does, like you say, seem to really be tackling the failure of the Deuteronomic answer to the problem of evil. And like you say, that part of it lacks a cosmic devil, and so it's not answering it with having a cosmic devil, and so it isn't as late as when Zoroastrianism is more influenced the Second Temple period, so the later Second Temple period. So I think you're exactly right. So there is I don't know offhand the dating for each of the different components, but there's a whole lecture on the book of Job that we've done. WN Consulting says, do we have any parallel stories of exile and later return to ancestral land with permission to rebuild a temple in the region? I don't think we have that as a particular, that exact thing, but we do have various laws from the Persian emperors who are allowing to have a tolerance, effectively religious tolerance. And so whereas earlier world empires like the Assyrians had really focused on destroying a foreign god's temple and just saying, our God, the God of Assyria, is the great God, and your God is defeated and in shame. Now the Persians have as their idea, no, actually we're going to, yes, we all are kind of becoming more and more Zoroastrian in our own court. That's becoming kind of our central world religion, but we are tolerant of all of the local religions and allow everybody to kind of practice their thing. And that also went along with the Persian administration, where they relied on local, large, important local governors, satraps, in order to keep the empire all cohesive and together. So it's able to be a much bigger empire as a result of some of that cosmopolitanism, of some of that tolerance. And so it does seem to be in keeping with what we know about the Persians. And it's also a reason why, out of all of these different empires, the ancient Jewish people get along the best with the Persians and don't get along as well with some of the other empires like the Greeks, who want everybody to Hellenize. So, all right. Well, in closing, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. If you're able, we always appreciate it if you're able to donate to the lectures at centerplace.ca/donate. The next lecture is going to be, who are the Samaritans? And then we're going to have a lecture on Donatism, and then we'll get back to our lecture on the worst crusade.